A new book on Israel's foreign policy called The Star and the Scepter, A Diplomatic History of Israel, approaches the subject from an all-encompassing perspective that retraces and explains the interactions of the Jews with other nations, from the ancient kingdoms of Israel to modernity. Author Emmanuel Navon, a professor of international relations at Tel Aviv University and the IDC Herzliya, and a fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and the Kohelet Policy Forum, says that historically the Jewish people have always been torn between sacrificing spirituality for political power or vice versa. He argues that the Jewish people have historically succeeded, including in the sphere of diplomacy, when they have found a way to balance these two elements. He spoke about the book with reporter Nomi Segal.
The book itself really examines Israel's foreign relations from a very wide historical perspective, going back to biblical time and antiquity. And the reason why I chose this title, The Star and the Scepter, I took it from this verse from the book of Numbers, where the prophet or the sorcerer Balaam is literally paid to curse the Jewish people and ends up blessing it. And one of the verses he pronounces is that a star will emerge from Jacob and a scepter from Israel. And my thesis is that historically the Jewish people has always been torn between, sacrificing spirituality for political power or political power for spirituality. And my thesis is that the Jewish people historically has succeeded, including in the field of diplomacy, by finding a delicate balance between a strong sense of historical mission on the one hand and a willingness to defend that mission and to fight for it physically in the real world on the other hand. The balance between the star, which symbolizes Jewish continuity and historical purpose, and the scepter, which symbolizes political power.
Does this vein inform the modern diplomacy, the identity? It's quite an exhaustive look if you're looking both at the ancient texts or history and then modern history as well.
That's right, and I think we saw it also with the rise of modern Zionism in the late 19th century, where you had some movements within the Jewish people that wanted to establish political power without any connection to Jewish history and the Jewish heritage, such as the Bund in Russia or the Canaanites in the British Mandate. And on the other hand, you also had Jewish philosophers, mostly German philosophers, such as Frank Rosenzweig and Hermann Cohen, who were completely opposed to Zionism and to political power because they thought that this would be incompatible with Jewish spirituality and with the role of the Jewish people in the world. And this struggle between, those Jews who only wanted to have spirituality without political power and those who only wanted political power without any kind of connection to Jewish history is a struggle that was found again with the establishment of modern Zionism and the state of Israel. And I think that one of the leaders really knew how to connect between the Jewish past and the present and political realism was David Ben-Gurion, who was very attached to Jewish history and to the Bible, but also knew how to adapt the political aspirations of the Jewish people in the real world at a given moment when the international arena and the conditions were not necessarily favorable to the Jews.
How would you say then that it plays out in our most contemporary time? Right now, I'm just thinking about this past summer when the issue of annexation and sovereignty in the West Bank came up and the recent normalization deals with Gulf Arab states.
So I think the annexation in particular and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in general is very typical of this tension that keeps coming back again and again in our history, in our diplomatic history, a tension between our aspirations, our ideals on the one hand, and political realism on the other, what is actually achievable at a given time and in the real world. And I think the whole issue of annexation is typical of this dilemma because Israel has legitimate historical claims over Judea and Samaria, but annexing the whole territory would, of course, completely change and upset the demographic balance of Israel, and that is, of course, not an outcome that anybody wants. So diplomacy is always about finding a delicate balance and sometimes compromise between reality, between political realism and ideals.
Do you examine also, when you're talking about the concept of Jewish spirituality, of Jewish nationhood, that there is even division within Israeli society on that matter?
That's right. Historically, by the way, the Zionist movement, as a political movement established by Theodor Herzl, was the first Jewish Congress in 1897, basically made a very clear claim, which was that the Jews are not only a religion, but also a nation. And this went against the ideology of Western assimilated Jews who had benefited from the Enlightenment and the Emancipation, who basically had assumed or wanted to believe that Judaism had ceased to be a nationhood and had become only a religion. But of course, with the rise of modern anti-Semitism in Europe and the Dreyfus Affair, the conclusion of Theodor Herzl was that emancipation and European Enlightenment had not delivered on this promise, and even though the Jews had abandoned the national aspect of their nationality, they were still considered alien nationals by the European nation, and therefore they had to come back to their nationhood. And this is, of course, that was of course one of the main claims of Herzl when he established the modern Zionist movement. And today, throughout the world, we still see people and ideologies around the world that still deny the Jews their right to self-determination and who deny the right of Israel to exist based on the claim that the Jews are not a nation but only a religion. So that struggle is not over.
So to that end, there is still the challenge of finding that balance between these two elements.
That's right, and I think that the religious and national elements in Israel's national identity continue to be a matter of debate. But on the other hand, I do think that many compromises have been found in recent years between Israel. What is the meaning of Israel as a Jewish state? And I think here also there's a lot of confusion when people say, some people say, well, what is a Jewish state? It's a particularist principle. It's against minorities. It's a religious idea, and it's not. The Jews, as I said, are also a nation. And when we talk about the concept of a Jewish state, it is a nation state for the Jewish people. And one cannot deny the legitimacy of a nation state for the Jewish people without denying the very legitimacy of the concept of a nation state. And most countries today are nation states, including in Europe. And I think that here, as I said, a lot of people around the world today, some ideologies, some thinkers, claim that the very idea of a Jewish state is unacceptable. Then they should apply the same principle to all nation states around the world, because you cannot deny the Jews their right to self-determination without denying that right to other nations. And I think we have to be very clear about this.
Professor Emmanuel Navon,